In certain moments, your mind does not settle when the situation itself has already come to a pause. Instead of quieting, it continues to generate thoughts that move beyond what is immediately necessary. One idea does not remain contained and begins to branch into possibilities, interpretations, and imagined outcomes that extend further than the original point. At first, this can feel like depth, as if you are being thorough or careful in how you think. However, the process often loses direction, and rather than moving toward resolution, it continues to expand without arriving anywhere definite. When external demands are low, this pattern becomes more visible, because there is nothing competing with the internal activity. Silence does not create rest, but becomes a space where thinking fills the gap. The mind stays engaged with its own movement, even when there is no clear problem that requires attention. This creates a subtle sense of incompletion, where thinking continues not to solve, but to maintain itself. In this state, the goal of thinking quietly shifts, moving away from resolution and toward continuation. You are no longer thinking to reach an answer, but thinking because the process itself has become familiar. The longer this continues, the more natural it begins to feel, even when it no longer serves a clear purpose. Because there is no defined endpoint, the mind does not recognize when to stop, and each thought leads to another without a clear boundary. This is how overthinking begins, not as a deliberate habit, but as a pattern that sustains itself through continuous movement. The reason this pattern continues is not because the mind is trying to solve more, but because it has not learned how to recognize completion. A thought begins with a question or a situation. Yet instead of moving toward a clear endpoint, it keeps extending into additional possibilities that feel necessary to consider. Each new angle creates the impression that something important might still be missing, even when the original issue has already been understood. This makes it difficult for the mind to conclude that it has done enough, because there is always another layer that could be examined. What appears to be careful thinking is often a process that avoids closure, not by intention, but by structure. The brain does not signal that the process is complete, so the thinking continues as if resolution has not yet been reached. This is where overthinking separates itself from productive thought, as the goal shifts from solving to maintaining engagement. Instead of reducing uncertainty, the process begins to sustain it, because each new consideration introduces additional variables. The mind becomes occupied with the activity of thinking itself, rather than the outcome it was originally meant to reach. As this continues, thinking starts to feel necessary, even when it no longer produces clarity. A noticeable shift begins to happen when thinking no longer simplifies a situation, but gradually makes it more difficult to understand. Instead of reducing uncertainty, each additional thought introduces new angles that feel necessary to consider, expanding the range of possibilities. What could have remained a single decision begins to branch into multiple scenarios, each one carrying its own set of variables and potential outcomes. This expansion does not feel unnecessary in the moment, because every added layer appears to increase clarity. However, the overall effect moves in the opposite direction, as the mind becomes occupied with managing complexity rather than resolving it. The more possibilities are generated, the harder it becomes to identify which ones actually matter. As a result, certainty does not increase alongside thinking, and in many cases, it begins to decrease. This creates a situation where more effort leads to less confidence, even though the intention behind the thinking is to feel more certain. Because of this, the mind continues to engage, attempting to recover clarity by producing even more thoughts. What forms is a cycle where complexity feeds further thinking, and further thinking feeds more complexity. This is the point where overthinking begins to drain mental energy, not through intensity, but through the accumulation of unresolved mental activity. Mental fatigue does not always come from doing too much in the visible sense, and it often develops through internal activity that never fully comes to rest. When the mind stays engaged for long periods without reaching resolution, it continues to consume energy even though nothing concrete is being completed. This is what makes overthinking so draining, because the system remains active without receiving the closure that would allow it to settle. A problem that is solved can release attention, but a problem that is repeatedly revisited keeps attention partially occupied. That partial occupation may seem small in each individual moment, yet it becomes significant when it continues across hours or even days. The fatigue that forms in this way is often difficult to explain, because there may be no obvious event that justifies the level of exhaustion you feel. You may not have done more externally, but internally, the mind has been running continuously in the background. This constant processing reduces the sense of mental spaciousness, making it harder to think clearly even when you try to focus on something simple. As the system becomes more crowded, ordinary decisions begin to feel heavier, not because they are more difficult, but because less energy is available to meet them. This is how overthinking slowly turns into mental fatigue through continuous inner effort that rarely reaches completion. A point is eventually reached where the system becomes tired, yet the thinking does not slow down in response to that fatigue. Instead of reducing activity, the mind continues to generate thoughts, even though the available mental energy has already decreased. This creates a contradiction where exhaustion and activity exist at the same time, making the experience feel difficult to regulate. Normally, fatigue would signal the need to stop or disengage, but in this case, the process that produces the fatigue is also the one that prevents it from ending. The mind does not fully register completion, so it does not transition into rest, even when it no longer has the capacity to process effectively. Because of this, thinking becomes less structured moving more quickly but with less clarity than before. Ideas begin to repeat, overlap, or lose coherence, yet the process continues as if it still needs to reach something. This is where overthinking shifts from active processing into a form of overprocessing, where the system continues to run without producing meaningful output. The effort remains, but the quality of thinking decreases, creating a sense of being mentally occupied without actually moving forward. As this state continues, it becomes harder to distinguish between useful thinking and activity that only maintains the cycle. When mental energy becomes depleted, the structure of thinking does not simply slow down, but begins to change in how it operates. Instead of moving in a clear and directed way, thoughts start to lose cohesion, making it harder to follow a single line of reasoning from beginning to end. The mind may still generate ideas quickly, yet those ideas feel less organized, often overlapping or repeating without adding new clarity. This is not because the brain is trying to process more, but because it no longer has the resources to process effectively. In this state, control over attention becomes weaker, not in a dramatic way, but through small shifts that are difficult to regulate. You may notice that thoughts move more freely, yet with less structure, making it harder to decide which ones are worth following. The filtering system that usually prioritizes relevant information begins to lose precision, allowing more inputs to pass through without evaluation. As a result, the mind becomes more crowded, even though the quality of thinking is decreasing. This creates a sense of being mentally busy without feeling mentally clear, which reinforces the experience of fatigue. What makes this more complex is that the system continues to operate even though its ability to organize and resolve thoughts has been reduced. This is how overthinking becomes harder to control, not because it becomes stronger, but because the system that regulates it becomes weaker. As control over thinking weakens, an important shift begins to take place in how thoughts are generated and sustained. The mind does not simply produce more ideas, but becomes less selective about which thoughts are allowed to continue. Without a clear filtering process, even minor or irrelevant thoughts can gain momentum, extending further than they would under normal conditions. This creates a situation where the volume of thinking increases, not because each thought is necessary, but because fewer thoughts are being stopped early. Instead of ending quickly, thoughts are given more space to expand, forming chains that are longer and more difficult to interrupt. At the same time, the reduced clarity within the system makes it harder to recognize which thoughts are useful and which ones are repetitive. Because of this, the mind begins to treat all thoughts with a similar level of importance, increasing the overall load. The more this happens, the more difficult it becomes to disengage, as each thought appears to require attention before it can be dismissed. This is how thinking begins to feel continuous, even though much of it does not contribute to resolution. What appears to be an increase in mental activity is often a decrease in the ability to regulate that activity. As a result, the system becomes self-sustaining, where the lack of control allows more thoughts, and more thoughts further reduce control. At a certain point, the attempt to stop thinking can begin to produce the opposite effect. When you become aware that your mind is overactive, the natural response is to try to control or reduce that activity. However, directing attention toward stopping a thought often requires engaging with it first, which keeps it active within the system. This creates a paradox where the effort to reduce thinking becomes another form of thinking itself. Instead of decreasing mental activity, the mind becomes more focused on monitoring its own state, which adds another layer of processing. In this state, each attempt to disengage can reinforce the presence of the very thoughts you are trying to move away from. The system begins to treat these thoughts as significant, not because of their content, but because of the attention being placed on them. As a result, thoughts can become more persistent, returning more frequently, and staying longer than before. This is how the experience begins to feel uncontrollable, even though the original intention was to regain control. What appears to be resistance is often a reflection of how attention is being directed within the system. The more effort is placed on eliminating the thoughts directly, the more the system continues to engage with them. A different approach begins to emerge when you stop trying to eliminate thinking, and instead examine how it is being engaged. The issue is not that thoughts exist, but that they are being followed in a way that extends their duration and influence. Each time a thought is treated as something that needs to be resolved immediately, it gains priority within the system. This priority keeps attention attached, allowing the thought to develop further than it would if it were left unengaged. What changes the structure is not forcing the thought to stop, but altering the way attention responds when it appears. When a thought is noticed without being extended, it does not disappear instantly, but it also does not gain additional momentum. This creates a different pattern, where thoughts are allowed to pass without becoming the center of ongoing processing. The system begins to differentiate between thoughts that require action and those that do not, restoring a level of selectivity. As this distinction becomes clearer, the overall volume of thinking starts to decrease, not because thoughts are suppressed, but because fewer of them are being sustained. This is how control is regained, not through force, but through a change in how engagement is distributed. A practical shift becomes possible when you begin to separate thoughts by function, rather than by intensity. Not every thought that feels urgent is meaningful, and not every thought that repeats deserves continued attention. One useful distinction is whether a thought leads to a clear action, or whether it only generates more mental activity without moving anything forward. If a thought points to something specific that can be done, it belongs to decision or action. If it only produces more scenarios, more checking, or more internal debate, it usually belongs to the overthinking loop. This distinction matters because the mind often treats repeated thinking as responsibility, when in many cases it is only extended processing without resolution. Another important question is whether the thought becomes clearer as you stay with it, or more complex. Useful thinking tends to move toward structure, while overthinking tends to multiply variables and reduce clarity. You do not need to eliminate the thought immediately, but you do need to recognize what kind of process you are inside. That recognition creates a boundary. Once the boundary becomes visible, attention is less likely to keep feeding the same cycle automatically. This is where mental energy begins to return, because the mind is no longer giving equal weight to everything it produces. Even when you are able to recognize the pattern, the cycle often continues because thinking is not driven by logic alone. There is usually an emotional layer beneath the process that keeps the mind engaged, even when the thoughts themselves are no longer useful. Uncertainty, discomfort, or the desire to feel in control can all act as forces that pull attention back into the same loop. In this state, thinking begins to function as a way to manage emotion rather than to understand a situation. The mind attempts to reduce discomfort by analyzing it, yet the analysis does not resolve the feeling, which keeps the process active. This creates a feedback loop where emotion triggers thinking, and thinking reinforces the presence of that emotion. Because of this connection, stopping the thoughts directly does not fully break the cycle, since the underlying tension remains. The system continues to return to the same patterns, not because the thoughts are necessary, but because the emotional state has not been addressed. As a result, the mind treats continued thinking as a form of control, even when it produces the opposite effect. This is why overthinking often persists, even when you understand that it is not helping. What appears to be a thinking problem is often sustained by an unresolved internal state that keeps reactivating the same process. A key misunderstanding within this process is the belief that thinking more will eventually resolve what feels unresolved. When discomfort appears, the instinct is often to analyze it further, as if a clearer understanding will remove the tension. However, not all internal states are resolved through thinking, and attempting to do so can extend the experience rather than reduce it. In these situations, thought begins to interact with emotion in a way that keeps both active at the same time. The more you try to understand the feeling through analysis, the more attention you give to the state itself. This attention reinforces its presence, making it feel more persistent than it might have been if it were left unprocessed at that level. The mind interprets continued engagement as importance, which keeps the system focused on the same loop. As a result, the effort to resolve the feeling through thought can unintentionally sustain the condition you are trying to move away from. This is why clarity does not always follow increased thinking, especially when the process is driven by discomfort rather than direction. What begins to change the pattern is not deeper analysis, but a shift in how the feeling is held without requiring immediate interpretation. Separating the presence of the emotion from the need to explain it reduces the pressure on the system to keep generating thoughts. A meaningful shift begins when the goal is no longer to stop thoughts by force, but to change the way the mind responds when they appear. The pattern is sustained less by the existence of thoughts themselves, and more by the speed and intensity of your reaction to them. When a thought appears and is immediately treated as something important, attention attaches to it before any real evaluation has taken place. That attachment is what gives the thought duration. What begins to weaken the cycle is creating a small pause between noticing the thought and following it. This pause does not need to be dramatic, and it does not require the thought to disappear. Its function is simpler than that. It allows you to recognize that a thought has entered awareness without automatically granting it control over your mental direction. In that space, a different response becomes possible. Instead of asking whether the thought is true, urgent, or complete, you begin by asking whether it requires engagement at all. This changes the structure of the experience, because the mind is no longer assuming that every thought deserves continuation. The first practical turning point is not better thinking, but slower engagement. When that happens repeatedly, the loop begins to lose momentum because fewer thoughts are being reinforced through immediate attention. This is where the cycle starts to loosen, not through suppression, but through a change in response. The pause that interrupts this cycle is not something abstract, and it does not require a complete change in how you think. It begins in small, repeatable moments, where you notice a thought without immediately moving in the direction it suggests. One practical way to create this space is to shift your attention from the content of the thought to the fact that it is occurring. Instead of following what the thought is about, you register that thinking is happening, which creates a slight distance between you and the process. This distance is enough to prevent automatic continuation, even if only for a brief moment. Another approach is to delay your response intentionally, allowing the thought to remain without acting on it right away. This does not remove the thought, but it changes your relationship to it. The urgency begins to weaken because it is no longer being reinforced through immediate engagement. It is also useful to identify moments where thinking starts to repeat without adding anything new. When repetition becomes visible, it signals that the process is no longer productive and that continuation is not necessary. By recognizing this point, you create an opportunity to step out of the loop rather than extending it further. These small adjustments do not stop thinking entirely, but they reduce how often thinking turns into overthinking. Even when the structure becomes clear, maintaining the change is often more difficult than understanding it. The pattern does not disappear simply because it has been recognized, and it tends to return in moments where attention is lower or emotional pressure increases. This happens because the system has been reinforced over time, and it continues to favor what is familiar, especially when energy is limited. In situations where you are tired, uncertain, or under stress, the mind is more likely to return to automatic patterns rather than apply deliberate responses. The pause that interrupts the loop requires awareness, and awareness becomes harder to sustain when the system is already fatigued. As a result, the pattern reappears, not because the method failed, but because the conditions that support it were not present. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Small, repeated adjustments gradually reshape the baseline, while occasional effort tends to be overridden by the stronger, established pattern. Another important factor is the environment, as constant stimulation or pressure can reinforce the tendency to overthink. If the system is continuously exposed to conditions that trigger the loop, the pattern remains active even when you try to change it. Sustaining the shift requires aligning both internal response and external conditions so that the system is not constantly pulled back into the same cycle. When you step back and look at the entire pattern, it becomes clear that overthinking is not a single problem, but a structure made of several connected processes. It begins with thoughts that do not reach completion, continues through a system that reinforces those thoughts, and stabilizes through repeated engagement that feels necessary. Along the way, mental energy is gradually consumed, emotional tension is sustained, and the ability to regulate attention becomes less effective. What makes this structure persistent is that each part supports the others. Unresolved thinking creates tension. Tension drives further thinking, and continued thinking prevents resolution. This is why the experience feels continuous, even though it is made up of smaller processes that repeat in sequence. Understanding this structure changes how you approach the problem. Instead of trying to fix everything at once, you begin to see where small shifts can interrupt the cycle. The most important point is not eliminating thoughts, but changing how they are engaged, how long they are sustained, and whether they are allowed to continue without direction. This creates a different relationship with thinking itself, where attention becomes more selective and less reactive. As this shift develops, the system begins to regain balance, not by force, but by reducing the patterns that previously kept it active. At its core, this experience is not about having too many thoughts, but about giving too many thoughts the same level of importance. When every thought is treated as something that needs to be followed, the system has no way to reduce its own activity. This is where the most important shift needs to happen. Not at the level of removing thoughts, but at the level of deciding which thoughts deserve continuation. The difference between clarity and exhaustion is often determined by this single distinction. When attention becomes selective, thinking begins to organize itself more naturally. Thoughts that are not reinforced lose momentum, while those that are relevant have space to develop without competition. This reduces the overall load on the system, allowing mental energy to be used where it actually creates value. What changes is not the presence of thinking, but the structure that determines how thinking is sustained. In practical terms, this means allowing many thoughts to pass without engaging, even if they feel incomplete. Completion is not always necessary, and attempting to complete every thought is what creates the continuous loop. The more consistently this distinction is applied, the more the system begins to stabilize. Overthinking loses its intensity, not because it is forced to stop, but because it is no longer continuously supported.